Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Trying to get this one done a little bit quicker without so long of a break between office hours. So welcome back, thanks for joining once again. Got a few more questions rounded up, figured I would just jump right into those. Not too much is going on. I guess the FOMO from FOSDEM has now passed. I think everybody is back okay. So that's all well and good. And life continues on and databases keep working, and at least hopefully they do. So with that, let's go ahead and get to your questions. I thought last time I mentioned, and maybe this is worth saying again, obviously none of this is considered professional advice, just an old DBA consultant telling you his thoughts and opinions on the world. So hope that works well for you. All right. First question of the day. This is not quite some of these questions. I do like the questions, but I always feel the need, like a lot of these cases, I got to deconstruct the question. So, question is MongoDB a suitable replacement for SQL-based relational databases like Postgres or MySQL? Why or why not? Unfortunately, they said the why or why not. It would otherwise be a very short one-word answer. So I think in deconstructing this question, you're going to have to decide what you mean by a replacement for SQL-based relational databases. I would say if you have a workload that fits well in a SQL-based relational database like Postgres, then MongoDB is not a suitable replacement. You probably don't want to do that, but I think that there's room outside of that. If you were to say, are there any workloads? It's really not so much about a replacement. Like, is it an alternative, maybe for SQL-based relational databases? You probably could get it to work. Now, obviously, I'm kind of an open source dude. I like relational modeling. SQL is what it is. I think for those reasons, I probably wouldn't say that you should look at Mongo. If you are like, well, I need something like document oriented or the cluster bits or whatever, like one, you can probably do that in Postgres and be okay. Shout out FairDB. But also, and I think Tembo actually just launched a FairDB stack, if I'm not mistaken. So you can fire up that whole thing and look at that as a Mongo alternative and doing it on Postgres and whatnot. So if you really think that that's what you need, I think there's Postgres options. But even still, I would say there are other systems out there you may want to look at as well that might, I guess, supposedly would fit towards more sort of that like JSON document kind of thing and give you the clustered, sort of architecture of having multiple nodes and all that. So I don't even know that I would say, and they're open source, right? Like on top of that. So I'd like to get all of those if I could. And I think you can. So that's just why I mentioned that. So there might be some workloads that I would say like it's a good alternative maybe to a SQL-based relational database, like a good workload that fits in Redis. I've seen people try to put that kind of workload in Mongo, and I would say Redis is probably a better option. Although again, just use Postgres. So that's kind of my reason. Like, obviously, it's going to depend. Like, you may not care about open source. I think that's probably short-sighted. So that might fit into the why or why not. But as a straight replacement, like if your workload fits well into SQL-based relational database, meaning like if you already have your app is already built using SQL and all that stuff, like you're using it now, like is it a suitable replacement? Like I would definitely not think it's worth the migrating cost to get out of the SQL thing and go into the other thing and rewriting apps and all that stuff. I think eventually you'll find the pain points and head back in the SQL based relational database direction. So that's just my thinking on it. And again, like there is some wiggle room there, I think, on workloads and whatnot that might fit in there. But to me, that's kind of the answer. So okay, second question. This comes from a I think this is an Indian name. I read my J's as H's in some languages. I'm not sure in Indian, so maybe it's Tejasari. Atapuri had asked, do we have a row-num function available in PostgreSQL to fetch row numbers in a table? And I think this maybe is not meant as a trick question. Again, I really do parse and analyze these questions when I read them to try to discern what are people really looking for. So the way I would answer that actually is maybe not what other people were thinking. Like there are no row numbers in a table. And this goes back to relational theory and the unfortunate sort of education that most folks have around SQL databases versus relational theory and relational databases. So right, a table is essentially an unordered collection. I'm going to say of rows to fit with the table. I know if you know, you know. But okay, so a table is just unordered set of rows grouped together, and there is no actual order to those, which is why, like when you read in the Postgres docs, like they say things like, there's no guaranteed order unless you put an order by clause in there, right? It could come in any row, and so when you ask like, can I fetch the row numbers in a table? Again, I'm going to say like, there's no row number in a table. Maybe you would say like, the primary key. I think maybe people would look at that and say like, well, I think that's the row number. Um, that really isn't a row number, right? Primary keys, if you're on an update heavy thing, again, like the data on disk is not going to come in the format that not in the order at least that the primary keys are in. So if it's insert only, right, and it's writing in, it just happens that in Postgres that will look pretty cleanly in the same order. But as soon as you start updating those rows, like they can go all over the place. So that is not the row numbers from the table. There's no row numbers to this table, even if there's a primary key. And again, a primary key doesn't have to be a number, right? A primary key could be something else that isn't numerical. So might still have order to it, but certainly wouldn't be a row number, right? If you had, like a UUID, like what is, if I give you 10 UUIDs and I say like put these, you could put them in order of a UUID, but if I asked you what row number any given one was, you wouldn't know. Like you might be able, you could sort of trick yourself into thinking with like integers or big ints or whatever. You might also say like a CTID. What about CTIDs? If you know a little bit of the internals, I talk about that in my Think Like a Postgres talk. I go into about how CTIDs are like the physical layout. It's kind of a numbering scheme Postgres has to determine where a row lives, within a table physically. But again, that's not really a row number. Those things are certainly volatile and change depending on what's going on. And any kind of update activity is certainly going to wipe that out. So because you mentioned the row num function in the question, right? Do we have a row num function available for Postgres? And the short answer there really is no, in that there's no row num function for that. But part of the reason for that is essentially that the row number is really something that is an affect of the result set that you get back when you make a query. And you can do row numbering if you have written a query, right, and you want those rows back and you'd like to put a number assigned to the rows. But that's not a guaranteed order. It's just going to put a number in with each row. So you could actually do that on the client side. People used to do that. I definitely saw people would do that with like cursors, like they would put the results in a cursor and then iterate through the cursor and add the row number in. I always thought that was horrible. Yeah, but people do what they got to do. The other way would be just get the result set back and iterate through it and then add the row number in if for some reason you need some kind of row numbering. But it was always dangerous because don't tie that back to the data in any way. Like it's not really real. Nowadays, what you would do is use there is kind of a row number function that you can do with like a window function. If you write your query as a window function, you can pull the result sets back as with a given row number. I finally got around to committing some of my old Pagila notes that I've used for different versions when I was showing people different things. I have one in there that's like top 5 by category that puts the number in. There's an example. I think it's sales top 5 by category, or maybe it's film sales top 5 by category. If you look at that view in the Pagila schema, you would see that where we add in the row number for each top 5 by category. So you can add a row number in, but remember the row number really doesn't have anything to do with the data itself, and it is always dependent on the actual rows numbering within the result set. Again, doesn't have anything to do with the table, doesn't have anything to do with the data, any of that stuff. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about row numbers in a table. That, so me being maybe overly analytical and critical on that. But otherwise, yes, row number, look for window functions and you'll be able to find that in there. And the thing is, I think it's a little more complicated to use that than it is with the row num function that I think this is Oracle related question. So if it's coming from that world, like Ronom was, I think, a little bit easier to use. I think SQL Server also has one. And again, I think it's a little bit easier to use because you can just use it with a regular SQL query. Like you don't have to put in a window function and whatnot. So in Postgres, I think it's a little more complicated, but you can do it. There is a way to do it in, actual real SQL. So, okay. Question number 3. It's very open-ended questions. This one in particular. So what is the future of Postgres's plpgsql? I'm not exactly sure what sparks this question, but I sort of think of like, if you're wondering, what I sort of assume is like, is this a thing I should care about if I'm a DBA? Like, how deep do I want to get into plpgsql? Should I make a career from it? Should I build a lot of new technology in plpgsql? And I think I sort of address these at different layers. And the first one I would say is that I cannot really imagine a Postgres system that doesn't have plpgsql in it, by default, available to use for things like scripting, right? Do scripts or custom functions, even at the SQL level. You can write your functions in SQL, and a lot of them will fit in that. But that little bit of proceduralness is just so incredibly useful. It's hard for me to see, that one Postgres would take that out for some reason, or even like a managed service provider would not allow you to have plpgsql in there. I suppose there might be some. If there are, I don't actually know of any. I'd be interested to hear one that doesn't give you plpgsql. Now, maybe some of this comes from, there's been buzz about things like people writing stored procedures in Rust for Postgres. And so is there a thought like, well, maybe that's going to become the new default? Like, I can't see that happening. It's just Rust is too niche of a language. Like, there's just not enough people who would know it. And then the learning curve, and also the security model and how you get Rust functions put in, it's not terribly worse than like C level functions, but like it is definitely, I think, a big gap between plpgsql and Rust based functions. So from my mind, I can't see that replacing it, or really anything else, right? Whether it's like PL Perl or PL Python, whatever, PL Ruby, any of those that have come. There was a PL Guile, right? Like, so there's been all kinds of different things, PL Bash, that are out there. I can't see any of those becoming a de facto thing. The one maybe, and I would be surprised if this is what was meant by the question, but just sort of thinking through it and covering bases. The plpgsql language that Postgres has is really based on PL SQL from Oracle as a general way of thinking of the syntax and design of the language, right? That was kind of the main thing. So in the SQL standard, though, there is a language that is essentially a procedural language called PSM. And at one point, I believe there was a PL PSM that somebody was working on. I don't believe it's still around or maintained. But the idea was to make basically a PSM flavored procedural language for Postgres. Had that seen more uptake and had that been consistently maintained, then maybe if you came to me and said like, well, is PL PSM going to replace plpgsql? I would, at least be open to the idea that I could see that potentially. But at this point, I would say like the lack of backwards compatibility that you would have is a huge sort of leap to get past. And I think the other problem is that the systems that are out there that Postgres is competing with at this point that care about procedural language stuff, I mean, it's basically two to my mind, is Oracle and SQL Server. MySQL has a large install base. I don't think it's very heavily, making use of functions and whatnot, which I think is part of why we saw PLPSM never got much uptake, never got much, there just wasn't the user demand for it. There weren't big shops moving that wanted to stick with PSM. I think it came from DB2 or one of the IBM databases over the years. It came out of, I believe that's where that came out of. But there just wasn't, I think people that were doing those kind of migrations just said, we're going to take this stuff and not put it in a stored procedure language. Going from one proprietary, arguably not that proprietary since it's the SQL standard, but kind of all implementations are somewhat proprietary. It's taking PSM, having to translate to plpgsql, and then maybe like 10 years from now, you translate something else, right? Like nobody wanted to get involved in that. So I think that might have been a thing. But now you've got people coming from Oracle are going to be, PLSQL is what they're going to want to do. and folks that are coming from SQL Server, they're going to want to use like TSQL. Neither of those are compatible with PSM. So I just don't really see that one picking up and taking off. And that would be the one that I would think, could really have kind of a leg up on if you were going to replace plpgsql. But that's, I mean, I think even if today somebody got started on it, like it'd be at least 5 years and probably more like 10, right? 5 years, if it could become the standard, we got to have this in Postgres, and then another 5 years of like deprecation, and we're not going to use the other one. So it seems so far fetched. So I think it's always going to be there. Whether the programming paradigm of using stored procedures ever comes back in the way that it was with Oracle 15, 20 years ago, I really don't see that happening. I think people are going to mostly keep, business logic and that kind of development outside of the database and push that into like libraries and whatnot used across applications. But as a skill to have as a DBA, like I think it is a good skill to have. It is one you should certainly be aware of and be ready to go into it. I do think the environment as a programming language is not great, but it kind of is what it is. And there are going to be cases, I talked a bit about in the talk that I did a couple of years ago about the int primary key and switching those around and writing triggers and whatnot, like being comfortable enough with plpgsql to be able to write those kinds of functions and deal with that type of workload all within the database, right? Like that, I think that's a skill that you want to have, certainly as you grow your Postgres DBA career, you'd want to have that. So I think that maybe speaks to the future of plpgsql. The other thing to hope for, I think, is just more people maybe championing it up a little bit to improve that experience of writing functions and whatnot. There's still a little bit of activity that is out there. I mean, there's always a few features every year that come in with the language and whatnot. So in any case, that's number 3. Okay, number 4. So in what situations should views be used instead of tables in database design? And I think there are cases where views start to come into play. I think as an initial design, if you're doing schema design, I would think you would design that without any views, right? Everything should basically be, normalized out into tables, and you want your data to work like that. And it kind of would be odd, I think, for me to think a view should go from day one. You should have views for something, because views to me, like really, like there's a sort of business logic and presentation piece to that. So the first place where I usually would say, views turn to them right away, to my mind, is when you're trying to kind of bridge between two different schemas, right? When the underlying schema needs to change, maybe you're taking a table. I've seen cases like a good example would be something where like you have some large text fields in a table and you say, you know what, like we could make this faster, splitting that stuff out. And we think the nature now, we look at how our data is kind of put into the, we had it in one big table and we sort of realized that's not the right relationship. So we're going to split that into another table. But you have applications that are expecting all that to be in one table, right? And so if you need a bridge between a single table and a multiple table, version of the same data, because your schema is evolving underneath, putting a view in place to, sort of make that schema look the same, even though the performance characteristics, may very well change underneath, but at least from an applications perspective, it would look the same, right? You put, like a legacy schema in there, and in this case, by schema, I mean the actual create schema legacy, and then you put a view in that looks like the old table, and then it just references whatever the new schema is going to look like, right? And you can make that all transactional, so everybody, just magically picks up the new thing, and they never see that it's a problem. You just have to change the search path to look for this new schema once it's there, right? And then it'll do the right thing for applications that need that. Then ideally, like you probably get rid of that eventually, but we all know eventually it never comes. So I think the other thing for views I have seen in a case that I understand at least is like if you want to enforce consistency across different applications when it comes to either some type of, I would say either query logic or possibly presentation of data or something like that. So a really simple example would be something like maybe you want to present users their name information back as like, first name space concat with the last name, right? So you're going to concat first and last name with a space in the middle, and you'd like everybody to be presented that same way, and you don't want to write that logic. obviously that logic's not complicated, but imagine a more complicated scenario. You don't want to have that logic be written in every application that's going to touch the database, right? So this is a case where, the first one, it's more the database needs to make changes underneath, and we'd like the application to not have to learn that or deal with that. Now we're flipping it to where you have multiple applications talking to sort of the one source of truth database, right? And you don't, whether it's a complex piece of SQL that returns a report, you may want to encapsulate that report inside of a view, or if it's, again, like some kind of presentation where you need to do some kind of transform. And a lot of times I'd love to push that out to the application, right? So I understand where most people probably do that, and I'm totally cool with doing that, make the application do that extra work. But there are cases where you would say, like, well, I've got one app over here that's written in a language and a different language over here, and then a third reporting thing over there. And so I need them all to see and present the same data back in the same way. And one simple way of doing that would be change it, closer to the source, rather than rely on everybody to do the same, the same sort of business logic encapsulated in their language in their library. So that would be another case where I would definitely, could see view usage. And then kind of alluding to that, I think a third one would be something like simplifying queries for reporting apps. Sort of the same idea of a very complex query. If you had to have that live in one application and then another app needs to report that same data, ideally, you wouldn't like copy pasta that query into a library in a different language and have to maintain both of those and make sure that they're in sync across projects. To me, like, I would say, yeah, you might want to put that into a view. And for reporting apps, I think it goes even further, because a lot of reporting apps, right, and I'm thinking of sort of like the dashboardy type stuff, not like you're writing code to build an app, but if you have a reporting system, you're going to extract data out. They just can't do the complex SQL, or you don't want people maybe writing complex SQL trying to figure this stuff out. So building a view that encapsulates that complex SQL, that makes it simple for people to query against, right? I think that's another like really good use case where I could see people putting those kinds of things out. And that could come early in the schema design process. Don't get me wrong. Like, to me, like the first phase of schema design is thinking about, well, I don't know, you can do this either way, but to me, like thinking about how you're going to actually store it physically, right? And then there's sort of a second piece, which is how you're going to present it, logically to applications and whatnot. I say you could do it either way, because actually I know I have done it the other way, where it was sort of like, well, what do we need to see as an application, right? We're building out some new feature or functionality or whatever, a new application. We know this is data that's going to come in. It's going to look like this. Here's how the app expects it to look, and here's how the app is going to give us the data coming in. And so that might actually be written out first, and then you sort of, again, denormalize it or normalize it, or both, depending on what you need, right? As you say, like, here's how the data comes in, here's how we want to spread it across different tables and whatnot. So, so early in that process, like, it's not like you have to like get everything deployed to production before you could write a view. That's a little bit too draconian. I think you could start early on and say, like, oh, well, we know we're going to need like these 5 reports, so we're going to make a report schema and we'll put the views in there, and then reporting users can have access to that. And if it needs to change over time, like, we'll make it change over time. So that's probably the third case. So okay, let's do one last question, then we'll get out of here. This one came from Ashik Reza. And I love the question. You're not going to like the answer. How do you select all but one column in Postgres? And the answer is, well, actually, you don't. I've seen some interesting proposals on this. There's no standard defined syntax for that. And some people have said, you could do like a select star, or like a select pound, comma, and then a column name. And instead of treating that like select star with select pound, it would be like, oh, well, in this case, we say we're going to grab everything except following columns, right? That might be in there. So I've seen different like proposed syntaxes, things like that. There really isn't one. Another way people saw this, actually going back to the previous question, is some people put views in place where they're like, well, we don't want this one particular column to be selected or be visible. We don't need it in the results. So like, we just make a view that excludes that, and then you can select star from the view. So that's definitely another way that people could do it. One thing that I do a lot, I thought I probably should do like a talk on this, but encapsulate into like PSQL variables, like a query that I might need, especially like something like pgstat activity. So, like if you go back far enough in time, remember I'm an old man. If you go back far enough in time, you would, and you want to know what's going on in Postgres, right? You would just select all from pgstat activity, because the information it gave you, there wasn't that much of it, right? And so you could get everything you needed from that, and it was great. And then people would actually do things that are a little more complicated, like, well, I'm going to join the PG lock to determine if it's actually waiting or not on a lock, and I add that in, right? So people would build their own custom queries against pgstat activity. But now I would say like it's almost the opposite, where there's so much information in pgstat activity that if you just jump in with PSQL and you're like select all for pgstat activity, it gives you too much information back, right? Like there's so many columns that are there that might mean something and you probably don't care about and whatever, that there is one where I know people are often like, how do I select like these like 10 out of the 15 columns or something, right? And there's just no good way to do that other than explicitly naming all the columns, and that can get annoying. So one way people do it is with views. They make their own custom pgstat activity. Another way, like I said, in SQL, in your PSQL RC, like I will make a custom query and put that in, depending on the nature of the system I'm working on. So that's another way to sort of attack that problem. But there's no like SQL defined way to do it, which is why Postgres doesn't have a way to do it. Unfortunately, I guess. Like I've never thought it was a huge thing to get hung up on, but I know there are definitely people who get hung up on that. So sorry, I don't have a better answer. But we're not always here for great answers. We're just here for answers. So it is what it is. All right, 5 questions. Hopefully you found that useful. If you've ever stumbled on those, if you have a question about those questions, obviously drop a comment. We're happy to, address anything if you guys are curious. Other than that, like, subscribe, please share with folks if you know someone struggling with their Postgres. We're here to help, as they say. And I think that's pretty much it. So till next time, everyone, take care of yourself, and if you can, take care of your database as well. All right, I'll see you in the next one.